Thank you, Tamar, and thank you to the organizers. So, I'm very happy to speak at this wonderful commemoration of 120 years of Genizah research. And my contribution here will be to revisit the beginning of Saadiah's commentary on the book of Genesis. And I came across, I got the idea to present this because I discovered this fragment, which you here see on my left. So as you can see, it's a real beauty. And while you kind of contemplate on its beauty, let me please start with a short introduction. So, in a recent article, Jonathan Moss draws attention to a remarkable coincidence that happened in 1949. Not knowing of each other's work, two scholars, one in New York and the other one in Cambridge, England, published a study on certain quite extensive similarities in method and terminology between rabbinic exegesis and Hellenistic rhetorics and grammar as practiced by the by the schools of Alexandria. The first is, as you might have guessed, Saul Lieberman in his Hellenism in Jewish Palestine, and the second is David Dole, Rabbinic Methods of Interpretation and Hellenistic Rhetoric. So, however, with regard to the historic explanation of the striking parallels on which both scholars agreed completely, they reached different conclusions. In a way, different opposing conclusions. So while Dow believed that the rabbis borrowed their exegetical methods from Alexandrian scholars directly, Lieberman maintained the view that they emerged independently and only adopted Alexandrian terminology. So these opposing views ask an important question as to interpret similarities and parallels. Moreover, this example shows that terms as influence and borrowing call for further reflections. Also, scholars on other periods and other geographic areas have faced similar uneasiness. In the introduction to Cultures of the Jews, A New History, David Bial addresses the adoption of non-Jewish culture among Jewish communities of 15th century Italy. The following quotation is lengthy, but I want to give it fully here. How should we label such adoption of non-Jewish culture? Does it suggest assimilation, or to use a less loaded term, acculturation? The Italian Jewish culture that produced our casket has frequently been described as one of the most assimilated and acculturated in all of pre-modern Jewish history. But perhaps the contemporary model of assimilation is misleading when applied to the Jews of Renaissance Italy. Here was a traditional community intent on drawing boundaries between itself and its Christian neighbors, but also able to adopt and adapt motives from the surrounding culture for its own purposes. Indeed, the Jews should not be seen as outsiders who borrowed from Italian culture, but rather as full participants in shaping of that culture, albeit with their own concerns and mores. The Jews were not so much influenced by the Italians as they were one organ in a large cultural organism, a subculture that established its identity in a complex process of adaptation and resistance. We may find it more productive to use this organic model of culture than to chase after who influenced who. So, end of quote. Such questions are particularly eminent also when dealing with Judeo-Arabic texts, as parallel to the adoption of the Arabic language, Jewish literature departed from earlier literary conventions of rabbinic literature. This happened in an Islamic context, and the embeddedness of early Judeo-Arabic literature in its Islamic context and the ways of writing is usually accepted. Moreover, a growing trend seems to identify influence and borrowing, and I say this now here in quotation marks, to Christian exegesis. Now, let me come back to the text. So in this paper, I want to take a test case. So the test case is the one you already see. It is Saadiah's commentary on the book of Genesis, Bereshit, the first chapter, and I will only deal here with the two first verses. This passage is very dense, and the sheer length it has in all the commentaries attests to this. The two first verses invite interpretation on the most central questions of belief. The omnipotence of God, the immediateness of creation, the modes of creation, so whether in time or not, and whether from something existing or not. This set of questions may be described as the more theological, philosophical questions. Another set of questions brings external science into the picture. How did the world created look like? What was its shape? How many spheres? What were there? And questions like that. So these we might call the cosmological questions. So cosmology, as you know, was not of major concern to Jews in the pre-Gaonic time. Rabbinic literature does not offer a coherent cosmology at all. And this particularly makes the description by Saadiah's cosmology, as he builds it in his commentary, particularly interesting. So a few more comments on the commentary. The commentary, as you know, has been edited by Moshe Zucker in 1984, and so basically he has to be given the credit for assembling this large mass of Genizah fragments. But then it turns out the commentary is not only incomplete, but also it has been noted in the reviews that it's actually not completely reliable. Sometimes the sequence of fragments is not entirely clear, and also his readings are sometimes not so reliable. Any further work on the commentary is further obstructed by the fact that due to many inaccuracies in the shelf marks, make localizing the original quite detective work. So how can we cure this situation? And the cure here goes on different levels. So first of all, we need to identify new fragments, and now I'm back to my fragment again. So this is the first step basically, and the fragment I have found here is what it seems to be quite an early copy, so it's on parchment, as you can see. And the script you see is what our colleague Judith Osho-Beschlager would call Northeastern Oriental script. I find this fascinating because it shows similarities to the script of some Ironic correspondence we have. Here, for example, is a letter of Shmuel ben Chofni, and here a letter of Saadiah Gaon, and they show the very same type of writing. So this makes the fragment, first of all, very early, and probably it places it in the geographic vicinity of the Yeshivot in Babel. So now, the fragment opens with the question whether the heavens and the earth were created together. And we must be clear that this is not the beginning of the commentary on Genesis, so there is a part that possibly or most likely preceded this discussion. We know, for example, from quotations in Saadiah's own work that he discusses the word Bereshit in a quite lengthy way, so there's a lot to say about what Bereshit means, if it's understood temporal or as the first thing, and also probably the word bara also should need some explanation. So we know that the fragment does not really start at the beginning of the commentary on Genesis. Now, so the next step, so now basically the first step would be finding new fragments of the commentary. So the next step would basically be to compare the commentary to what Saadiah says in his other books. And most prominently here, I have to mention Kitab al-Mabani, so that's the commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, where he speaks quite a lot about cosmology, and also in his Kitab al-Amanat wal-Iyat al-Fadat, which is in one of the Deot, there he more speaks about the creation ex nihilo and the more theological, philosophical questions. Now, the next step basically would be comparing Saadiah's commentary to other Judeo and Samaritan Arabic commentaries. There's an email thing. The first one is the commentary by David al-Muqammas. So David al-Muqammas, as you know, was active in the 9th century, and only one fragment of the commentary basically survived. So it's interesting that Kirgistani in his commentary calls this commentary by al-Muqammas basically a commentary on the 6 days of creation. So scholars therefore have argued that we have to, George Weider and Ronny, for example, have therefore argued that we have to see this commentary by David al-Muqammas basically as a Jewish form of the Hexameron literature. So basically the literature that tries to comment on the 6 days of creation. So further support of this Christian, the engagement with Christian literature has been found by Sarah Stromza. She also very clearly shows that he must have studied with the West Syrian theologian Nonus of Nisibis. So the next scholar here that we have to mention is Jacob al-Kirgistani, and we will hear more about that from David later. So the commentary by Jacob al-Kirgistani is therefore important, and I mean here the Kitab al-Riyad is therefore important because it very closely follows the structure and the argumentation of Saadiah's tafsir, to a degree that basically Moshe Zucker could use it to reconstruct the commentary from Saadiah. So that makes it an important source to establish Saadiah's, the text of Saadiah's commentary. So again, now here's something interesting. Kuno Kiesa again noticed that certain interpretations have striking precedence in the Syriac Hexameron literature. So again, we have a hint towards this direction here. And I want to mention a third commentary that is very important to reconstruct the commentary of Saadiah on Genesis, which is a Samaritan commentary, and that by Saadiah ibn Munajjah. So Saadiah ibn Munajjah lived in the 13th century, and his commentary actually has almost never been studied until Frank Weigelt made it available in a PhD 2 years ago. And also Frank Weigelt reads this commentary in a very close relation to the hexameric corpus. So now we have a couple of hints that hint towards the hexameric corpus in the background of these Judeo-Arabic and Samaritan Arabic commentaries. So let me quickly explain to you what that is, the hexameric literature. So the genre of hexameron, that is commentaries dealing specifically with the 6 days of creation, have a long standing in Christian literature, both in Greek and in Syriac. So these commentaries steer the commentators in a direction intended to answer very contemporary questions of meaning, as they try to reconcile the biblical account with contemporary natural philosophy, in particular that of Aristotelian kinds. So, very easily put, the purpose of these commentaries is to bring on par scientific models of creation and cosmology with the Bible. Thus, they stand somewhat halfway between traditional exegesis on the one hand and rational scientific cosmology on the other. Now, a starting point of this development is Basil of Caesarea, who wrote a very famous commentary on the 6 days of creation, and there he presents a Christian cosmology that is in harmony with the biblical text. And even more prominent is John Philoponus. You have the dates here, who's also known as John the Grammarian or John of Alexandria. So since his works are very closely closely connected to the city of Alexandria and the Alexandrian Neoplatonic school. He wrote a refutation of Aristotle's belief in the eternity of the world and published a commentary on the creation stories, which is the one he quoted, De Opificio Mundi, on the creation of the world, which is his only theological work extant in Greek. So while discussing the biblical text, Philoponus frequently refers to philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy, and as well to Basil the Great, whose own treatise on creation served him as inspiration. The Syriac tradition knows two, but also more important Hexameron commentaries. The first is by Jacob of Edessa, and the second is by Moshe ben Haifa. So, let me quickly summarize what I've said until now. It's basically looking at the commentary on Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis and the verses. We see that the aforementioned commentaries, Judeo-Arabic and Samaritan Arabic, show a very similar structure. They follow a similar structure and they use similar arguments. Scholars have already previously sensed the connection to Christian Hexameric literature, and it's basically in Greek and the Christian commentaries of the Hexameron. We find the attempt to prove basically that the biblical account of creation is universally accepted theory and can be detected also on the grounds of scientific literature, and this is an attempt also shared by Jewish authors. So now let me finish with a few examples from Saadiah's concepts of creation, and I will focus on the cosmology here. As I said, the first lines of the commentary basically start with the attestation of God's omnipotence and demonstrate that the creation was in time, immediate, and out of nothing. This not only means that God exists, since He is the prime impetus for creation that brings everything into being, but also confirms that He must be one, since nothing existed prior. So parallels to this, and I don't want to go into this in detail, parallels are found in his Kitab al-Amanat, and they have been thoroughly studied, so that I shall not repeat this here. But the interesting thing is that previous research has identified close parallels to John Philoponus. So that's the one we encountered earlier. So it might be fascinating now for the cosmology to also compare Saadiah with John Philoponus. So let me go into the commentary a little bit. So the first question that Saadiah is asking in his commentary is basically, if the Bible talks about the first thing that was created, so Awwalu ma khalaqa is the beginning of his comment, of the translation. So the first thing that was created, why then are there two objects? So the heaven and the earth. So the answer is very clear. Both of them have been created together in the same entity of time. So, and his commentary reads, here he states, Et ha-shamayim ve'et ha'aretz, the heaven and the earth, and there he says, Koreh ani eleihem ya'amdu yahdav, when I call unto them, they stand up together. To express clearly that both of them were created together in the smallest amount of time. Thus is removed the view of him who thinks that the creation of the heavens and preceded the creation of the earth, since it is said that they were created together. So this explanation has a close parallel also in Philoponus, who says in conjunction God created the heavens and the earth. Some say that in conjunction and Kefa Layo is the same as in the beginning. I say that the heaven and earth God created together in the smallest inseparable amount of time, as He did not create one before the other. So here we have not only the interpretation of the same word Bereshit, but also his argumentation is basically quite similar. Now, moving on, so now basically heaven and earth have been created together, and so the next question that he addresses is basically, it's the concept of the impetus of creation that creates everything that is contained between earth and heaven. So Saadiah says, for example, since it was merely made known to us that the two boundaries were created, the heaven and the earth, it is compulsory to understand that everything that is contained between them must be equally created. For what has no support to be contained in it cannot be created. The support for the elements of water and air, albeit it has been created, remained insufficiently narrated to us in the first verse, until the second verse came to establish beyond all doubt that the earth had been created previously. And the earth, which, as I have told you before, that it was created, I do not mean only the element earth, but I imply the four elements: earth, water, air, and wind, as well as everything in between the celestial spheres and the ground. So basically the commentary now here tries to show us that basically God, in the smallest amount of time, at the very beginning of creation, basically created both boundaries. So the center boundary and the other boundary, and basically in this moment of creation, everything and all the elements and the spheres were already contained in that. So now the very same idea is found in Philoponus. All commentators have shown rightly that between the two boundaries, heaven and earth, also the remaining elements, water, air, and fire, are contained. So basically it's here the very same idea. No, I'm coming slowly to the end. Yeah? So basically the creation of water and earth is not difficult to extract from the two verses. Bohu is the center of the earth. Tohu and Tehom both refer to the primordial waters. So that is pretty clear. Saadiah and Philoponus both derive Tohu and Tehom from the same word, which is also interesting. It is more difficult to identify the element water, the element of air, and there he has, I explain it very quickly. Basically he says, well, the element of air can be found in the word choshet, because choshet is nothing but the absence of light, which must be have a support, and this support is earth here. So when the Bible says choshet, it only wants to tell us that the air has been created. So very similar, says Philoponus, it's true, the meaning darkness is nothing than the absence of light, so this means this is the air that was created. So here again, very similar basically interpretation. Now, to conclude, basically, what I have shown is that first of all, you have to place Saadiah and all other Judeo-Arabic commentaries on the first chapter of Genesis in the context of the Hexamaic tradition. The traces for such a conclusion have already been laid by previous scholars, which I can only confirm. The extent of parallels, however, calls for a careful explanation. My particular contribution today has been to show the parallels to one of the prominent examples of the Hexamaic corpus, the Opificio Mundu by John Philoponus. Now, a couple of questions remain. No Arabic translation of this work is known, so I don't know how this reached Saadiah. I also have not dealt with the Muslim literature here, which also has a lot of parallels. And the last question that I will remain for the next talk is basically also, how does Saadiah continue or indirectly reject maybe rabbinic cosmology? This is also something that needs to be studied further. And the last question basically is to ask, how do we conceptualize such a striking similarity? And is it really the similarities we have to look at, or is it actually the differences that are really interesting? And this is with what I have to close, I guess. Yeah.
Some of the texts of Saadiah that you really improved from the machine.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important to see what elements are clearly derived from the machine, what are innovative within the Jewish tradition, and therefore are more likely to be related to Philadelphus. And second is that by this wonderful description of the origin of Kalam in the Moreh Nevuchim, the first part, chapter 71, as related to Syrian Christians that gave some traditions to the Arabs, and from the Arabs to the Kalam for the Saadiah. And I think that this is the area, that's what you were speaking about.
Yeah. As for the rabbinic literature, yeah, I agree. This is what I mentioned, but I have not really done. But also, this is not so uncomplicated. So, because also, like, the cosmology is basically dealt with in Bereshit Rabbah and then in Chagiga in the Babli. These are also quite late texts, actually. So, they are most certainly after Basil, and some of them probably after John Philoponus. So, it's very complicated to see what's going on. So what I was arguing is that you shouldn't really, speak about influence, but rather see it as one pool, one whirlpool of kind of very complex interactions. So, but you're right that this is a topic that I need to go into further. Yeah.
Final question. It was fascinating. Thank you. Can we go back to the first Saadiah? Yeah. So it's very interesting. There are two, a comment and a question. So one about the issue of in here, so you wrote in the smallest amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were created in the smallest amount of time. In Arabic, was that filhal? I was just wondering, so I think, is that filhal? In that case, I would probably have translated filhal at the same time, and not in the smallest amount of time. Then you show me Philoponus, and I see that's exactly what he says. Yeah. So I'm interested in this. I mean, so what is that? So it has to be the smallest amount of time because then that proves that it was together. Is that it?
Yeah, and also the time starts there. So everything, I mean, there is no time before that. The time starts with this creation of the heaven and the earth, the outer and inner boundaries. That's why everything in the shortest inseparable amount of time has to be created. Like it's basically a Big Bang. It makes boom, and then it's there.
And is it to how? Do you remember the Arabic thing?
I have no idea. I'll have to look it up.
So if not, you check it. Because I was interested, just because you know how Yefet in this area, he talks about the 10 ahwab. I don't know, it's interesting. Anyway, and the other thing is, wouldn't you say that probably this kind of thing would have been mediated by Al-Muqammas, because they were reading Al-Muqammas' commentary?
Yeah, the problem is we cannot really compare it because there's nothing out of the commentary. It might very likely be. Yeah.
According to the tradition, so it mentioned in the same Tamid, there are 10 שאלות שאלו את לפני הנגב לצד הבדון. השאלות are also, מי קדם ממי שמיים וארץ, and מי נברא תחילה אור וחושך. So it's not only internal rabbinic interpretation, but also we see that Talmud is aware that this is a common questions, issues that are dealt by Alexander Gordon.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay. Thank you.